Third chapter. Listening to time. Here's a summary of the major cycles of history concepts as described on the mainstream published entries that treat history as cyclical or pattern rather than purely linear. 1. Social cycle theory. This is a general sociological idea that societies undergo repeating stages or cycles rather than only evolving forward. It's one of the classic cyclical views of history, contrasting linear progress theories, and has roots in ancient as well as modern thought. Argues that key social stages and events recur in roughly similar patterns. Has precursors such as kuklos in Greek philosophy and concepts like asabiya in Ibn Khaldun's work. 2. Historical recurrence. This is the broader concept that similar historical events tend to reoccur, not necessarily in a fixed periodic pattern, but through recognizable resemblances. Covers everything from repeated rises and falls of empires to analogous political patterns centuries apart. It doesn't strictly define fixed cycles, but highlights recurring themes and structures. H3. Dynastic cycle, China. 3. Dynastic cycle, China. A classic example of cyclical history from Chinese historiography. Traditional theory is that Chinese dynasties rise, reach a peak, decay, often with corruption, fall, and are replaced by a new dynasty. The cycle is tied to the concept of the mandate of heaven. Rulers lose it when they fail morally and politically. Seen by some historians as a heuristic pattern rather than a literal mechanism that governs all history. 4. Cyclical theory, U.S. history. Specific historical cycles identified in American politics. Includes theories like alternation between liberal and conservative periods. Reflects recurring dynamics in national policy and public mood, not an exact periodic timeline. 5. Strauss-Howe generational theory. A widely known cyclical theory, especially in Anglo-American historical interpretation. Proposes that society cycles through 4 turnings, roughly every 85 years, a saeculum. High to awakening to unraveling to crisis, to repeat. Each phase reflects different generational archetypes and collective moods shaping behavior and institutions. 6. Kondratiev wave, economic cycle. While not a historical cycle in the political sense, this economic theory is included as a long wave cycle affecting modern history. Proposes 40-60-year waves in economic growth and stagnation. Based on patterns of technological innovation and sectoral change. What doesn't endorse as a universal law? It's important to note that most academic historians do not consider history to be governed by precise, inevitable cycles. These theories exist as models or interpretations, not as established laws of human development. The following table is titled Summary of Types O Cycles. It can be described as follows. This table summarizes several major types of cycles that scholars use to interpret recurring patterns in history, society, and the economy. First are sociological cycles. These describe patterns that emerge in society, culture, and systems of governance. An example is social cycle theory, which examines how societies evolve and reorganize over time. Second is historical recurrence. This concept refers to the idea that certain events or patterns tend to repeat throughout history. It focuses on the recurrence of similar developments across different historical periods. Third are political dynastic cycles. These describe the rise and fall of ruling powers or dynasties. A well-known example is the Chinese dynastic cycle, where periods of stability and prosperity are followed by decline and the emergence of a new ruling house. Fourth are national cyclical theories. These focus on recurring patterns within a specific country. One example is cyclical interpretations of United States history that identify repeating political or social phases. Fifth are generational cycles. These describe broad societal moods that change as new generations emerge and replace older ones. A prominent example is the Strauss-Howe theory of generational cycles. Finally, there are economic cycles. These refer to long-term patterns of economic growth and decline. A classic example is the Kondratiev wave, which proposes long economic cycles lasting several decades. The table description has ended. Here are specific, concrete examples of historical cycle theories as described on and supported by reliable sources, showing how each concept has been applied to real history. 1. Dynastic cycle, China. Rise and fall of dynasties. In traditional Chinese historiography, political power rises and falls in a repeating pattern. A new dynasty forms and consolidates power. It reaches a peak in culture, economy, and order. Corruption and decline set in. The dynasty collapses and is replaced by a new one. This happens under the idea of the mandate of heaven, meaning rulers are legitimized by cosmic approval until they lose it through corruption or failure. It's a repeating macro pattern that many historians recognize as a useful motif for interpreting Chinese history, even if they debate how rigidly cyclical it truly is. Example cycle: Qin dynasty to Han dynasty to Sui, to Tang to Song, to Yuan, to Ming to Qing. Each follows roughly the rise-peak-decline pattern, though the lengths and details vary. 2. Strauss-Howe, Generational Cycles, American and Western History. According to the Strauss-Howe generational theory, history unfolds in a roughly 80 to 90-year cycle called a saeculum, composed of 4 turnings that together make one complete cycle of society's moods and behaviors. The 4 turnings, eras. High-strong institutions, collective optimism, for example, post-World War II, era 1946, 1960s. Awakening, spiritual revival, rebellion against conformity, for example, cultural revolutions of the 1960s, 70s. Unraveling, rising individualism, institutional decay, for example, late 1980s, early 2000s. Crisis, societal upheaval and reconstruction, for example, Great Depression/World War II era, arguably 2008 to 2030 today. Saeculum pattern. This cycle repeats across multiple periods of U.S. and Anglo-American history, with major crisis moments roughly every 80 to 100 years. 3. Kondratiev waves, long-term economic cycles. The Kondratiev wave, K-wave, is an economic cycle concept that posits long waves in economic growth and stagnation lasting roughly 40 to 60 years. How it works. Each Kondratiev wave includes long periods of expansion/prosperity, often connected to major technology revolutions. Stagnation or relative slowdown. Proposed cycles include ones associated with early industrialization, steel/rail networks, mass production, information technology, etc. Example timeline, typical estimates from literature. 1780 to 1830, first wave, steam engines, early industrial revolution. 1830 to 1880, second wave, railroads, steel. 1880 to 1930, third wave, electrification, heavy industry. 1930 to 1970, fourth wave, mass production and consumer boom. 1970 to 2000 plus, fifth wave, IT and digital revolution. A sixth wave is sometimes proposed to begin in the 2000s with information and biotech technologies. Note: most mainstream economists are skeptical about fixed long waves, but it widely discussed literature. 4. Other economic and business cycles. Other Main Street historians list additional economic cycles shorter than Kondratiev waves, but still cyclical. Kuznets swings 15 to 25-year cycles tied to construction and demographics. Hugler cycles 7 to 11-year investment cycles. Kitchen cycles 3 to 5-year inventory and short business fluctuations. These represent nested cycles within larger ones, akin to rhythms within rhythms. The following table is titled Summary Business Cycles. It can be described as follows. This table summarizes several well-known theories that describe recurring cycles in political history, society, and the economy. Each theory focuses on a different domain and operates on a different time scale. First is the dynastic cycle, which belongs to the domain of political history. Its length is variable. A classic example is the rise, peak, and eventual decline of Chinese dynasties, where a ruling house emerges, consolidates power, gradually weakens, and is eventually replaced by a new one. Second is the generational cycle, associated with the Strauss-Howe theory. This cycle concerns societal moods and political change, and typically lasts about 80 to 90 years. One example begins with the post-World War II high, followed by the cultural awakening of the 1960s, the period of unraveling in the 1980s through the early 2000s, and the crisis period beginning around the financial crisis of 2008. Third is the Kondratiev wave, which focuses on long economic cycles linked to innovation and industrial development. These cycles usually last between 40 and 60 years. Examples include major waves driven by industrialization, steel production, electrification, and later mass production technologies. Finally, there are shorter economic fluctuation cycles, often associated with economists such as Kuznets, Hugler, and Kitchen. These cycles operate over shorter periods, roughly 3 to 25 years, and are often related to construction activity, investment patterns, and broader business fluctuations. The table description has ended. Specific historical examples with approximate dates tied to major cycle theories found in linked scholarly sources, including generational cycles, Strauss-Howe, dynastic cycles, China, long economic waves, Kondratiev, and broader historical recurrence. 1. Strauss-Howe, generational cycles, saeculum. According to the Strauss-Howe theory, Western and especially U.S. history can be divided into repeating 80-year cycles called saecula, each made up of 4 turnings lasting 20 to 22 years each. Key cycle examples: U.S., Anglo-American. Civil War saeculum, 1794 to 1865. Crisis phase around the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Prior turnings include the era of good feelings, high, and reform movements such as abolitionism, awakening/unraveling. Great Power saeculum, 1865 to 1946. Reconstruction and expansion after the Civil War, high. Progressivism and early reforms, awakening. World War I in the 1920s, unraveling. Great Depression and World War II, crisis. Current saeculum, approximately 1946 today. High. Post-World War II prosperity, circa 1946 1960s. Awakening. Cultural revolutions, circa 1960s 1980s. Unraveling. Late 20th/early 21st century cultural fragmentation, circa 1980s 2008. Crisis. Often dated from the 2008 global financial crisis onward, continuing into the early 2030s per modern interpretations. The following table is titled Turnings in Theory. It can be described as follows. This table outlines the four recurring phases, or turnings, described in the Strauss-Howe theory of generational cycles. Each turning represents a distinct social mood and typically lasts about 20 years, together forming a full cycle of roughly 80 to 90 years. The first turning is the high. This phase follows a major crisis and is characterized by strong institutions, social cohesion, and a sense of collective confidence. Society tends to value order, stability, and shared progress. The second turning is the awakening. During this period, people begin to challenge established institutions and cultural norms. Individual expression, personal freedom, and spiritual or cultural renewal become prominent themes. The third turning is the unraveling. In this phase, institutions weaken and public trust declines. Society becomes more fragmented, individualism grows stronger, and political and social divisions tend to intensify. The fourth turning is the crisis. This is a period of major upheaval in which society confronts profound challenges. Political, economic, or military crises often lead to the restructuring of institutions and the creation of a new social order. Once the crisis is resolved, a new high begins, and the cycle starts again. Dates are approximate and illustrative of the theory. The table description has ended. 2. Dynastic cycle, China. This is the classic example of a cyclical pattern in political history, especially in Chinese thought. Cycles of rise, peak, decline, and replacement. The dominant idea, the mandate of heaven, justified a dynasty's legitimacy until its decay and collapse. Typical pattern, no fixed timeline. Emergence and consolidation of a dynasty. Peak and prosperity. Decline and loss of mandate of heaven. Collapse and replacement by a new dynasty. Historical dynasty transitions, China. The Qin dynasty unified China in 221 BC, till by 207 BC. Han dynasty, 202 BC to 220 AD, expanded and consolidated. Succeeding dynasties, Sui, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing, show repeated cycles of rise and fall until imperial rule ended in 1912 AD. The dynastic cycle is not an exact period, like 80 or 50 years, but represents patterned political turnover over centuries. 3. Kondratiev long economic waves, 50 to 60 years. The Kondratiev wave is a proposed economic and technological cycle, long waves of expansion and contraction, linked to major innovations and structural change. Typical Kondratiev waves, broad estimates. 1780 to 1830, Industrial Revolution, steam and textiles. 1830 to 1880, railways and steel. 1880 to 1940, electrification and heavy industry. 1940 to 1985, scientific tech. Revolution, mass production, automotive. 1985 to 2015, Information and Telecommunications. 2015 to 2035, Hypothetical Wave Tied to AI/Renewables, Theory-Based, Debated. These waves are economic and technological rhythms rather than strict political cycles. Many economists debate their precise dates and existence. 4. Historical recurrence. Waves in European history. Separate from specific models like Strauss-Howe or Kondratiev, describes broader historical recurrence patterns. For instance, long waves in European history identified by historian David Hackett Fisher. Example of recurrence pattern. Fisher proposed 4 waves of European history, each 150 to 200 years long, with recurring dynamics. Prosperity to inflation to inequality to rebellion to war. Ending in long equilibrium until the next cycle. These are broad multi-century patterns rather than exact cycles. The following table is titled Summary with Dates. It can be described as follows. This table summarizes several major cycle theories and provides approximate time spans along with historical examples that illustrate how these cycles unfold. First is the generational cycle, also known as the saeculum. This cycle typically lasts about 80 to 90 years and is divided into 4 phases. In the United States, an example begins with the post-World War II, high from 1946 to 1964, followed by the awakening from 1964 to 1984, then the unraveling from 1984 to 2008, and finally the current crisis period beginning around the late 2000s. Second is the dynastic cycle, particularly associated with Chinese history. This cycle does not have a fixed duration and can span multiple centuries. Chinese history provides repeated examples of dynasties rising, consolidating power, gradually declining, and eventually being replaced. These cycles occurred repeatedly from roughly 221 BC, with the Qin dynasty, through the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. Third is the Kondratiev wave, a long economic cycle lasting approximately 50 to 60 years. These waves are often associated with major technological and industrial transformations. Examples include waves beginning around 1780, followed by shifts around 1830, 1880, 1940, and later periods linked to new technological revolutions. Finally, the table includes historical recurrence waves, which span roughly 150 to 200 years. These broader patterns reflect alternating periods of expansion, conflict, and reorganization in world history, particularly visible in the historical development of Europe and other major civilizations. The table description has ended. Notes. These cycles are frameworks or theories, not guaranteed predictors. They are debated among historians and economists. Strauss-Howe is often applied to U.S. and Western history. Kondratiev waves focus on economic/technological long waves rather than political events. Dynastic cycles are rooted in traditional Chinese historiography. Here is a detailed overlay of major historical cycle theories matching real leaders, dates, events, and eras as described in complementary sources. These connect cyclical patterns in society, politics, economy, and dynasties to concrete historical moments.